All right, welcome back to another episode of ICU Doc Talk. Today I'm going to be talking about a critical care team or an ICU team. Everybody that is involved on an ICU team. There are so many people that make up a team. It's not just the physician, the doctor. It's a ton of people that get patients through critical illness and that also help patients die appropriately, meaning they do not have prolonged suffering in the ICU. So I want to just talk about each member of the ICU team and briefly what they do. And by doing this, I will also reveal a lot of my ignorance about what all of these people do. So if you're like, a physical therapist or an occupational therapist or speech pathologist, you might be wringing your hands being like, that's what you think I do? I do so much more than that. And I wish I could go into even greater detail about everyone, but I will try. I will do my best. So here we go. Okay, let's start with the physician or the doctor that is leading the ICU team. And I use the word leading, not as a way of being like, let me just back it up. I hate power hierarchies. Okay. I really hate the idea of working beneath and above somebody. I really dislike power hierarchies. Unfortunately, that's kind of just the organization of our modern society and like how, corporatocracies work, and hospitals are no different. Technically the ICU doctor, or which is also called an intensivist or a nocturnist, leads the team and bears a lot of the responsibility of the outcomes with patients and things like that. But the ideal ICU doctor should lead the team by making consensus decision making with everybody else on the team. So what does the intensivist or the ICU doctor actually do on the team? So from my perspective, and this is going to be a subjective thing, like you ask, so I'm an ICU doctor, right? So I know what an ICU doctor does. But you ask another ICU doctor and they may have slightly different answers. But I would say, to boil it down in the simplest terms, what the ICU doctor does is being an expert in critical decision making in the moment and bearing the ultimate responsibility of the outcome that happens. The intensivist, the ICU doctor, is thinking more globally about the patient. We are also getting in the nitty-gritty details of all the different organ systems that is happening with each patient, but we are thinking also globally, what is going on with this patient? And then we're thinking globally about the entire ICU, because we are running the along with everybody else, we're running the whole ICU, which consists of multiple patients, right? Anywhere from 12 to 25, patients, maybe even more, depending on what service you're on. And there's different types of ICUs that we work in. I work in a cardiac ICU. I also work in a medical surgical ICU. I also work in a tele ICU. There are neurocritical care ICUs. There are trauma ICUs. There are burn units. There's many different types of ICUs that an intensivist is in charge of. The intensivist or the ICU doctor is leading end-of-life care discussions. So if a patient is likely not going to survive, and the team believes the patient's not going to survive, it is the ICU doctor, in consultation with maybe a surgeon or other people that are involved with that care team, like an oncologist or many other different types of providers. They are typically, and with palliative care, I should say, they're typically leading that discussion, not just leading the discussion, but bringing the family to the point to even have that discussion. They are the go-to person to giving updates and things like that. Now, obviously, the ICU doctor is also an expert in critical care. They are boarded in critical care, and they have varying degrees of experience, right? But they're an expert in critical care. So there are many critical care issues that come up with patients, and an ICU doctor should know how to treat these things off the top of their head. They should be very proficient. They should be competent. They should be very professional. An ICU doctor generally leads a code blue that we call in the United States, or cardiac arrest or respiratory arrest. The ICU doctor should be there, available right away to bring a patient back up from whatever is going on. If they are about to die or if they are dying, they are in charge of leading that team and bringing that patient back, along with many, many other people that I'm going to get to. The ICU doctor is also in charge of transfers, accepting patients to the ICU, accepting a transfer from another state. Depending on where they work, if you're in a big academic hospital, which I am at, I'm in charge of transferring patients, triaging patients, deciding if a patient is appropriate for the ICU. If maybe they're not sick enough, maybe they don't need to come to the ICU. The ICU doctor should be like, no, this patient doesn't need to come here. They are safe to go to the medical wards or the surgical wards. So that is a big part of a job, which can be a huge headache. An ICU doctor is also an expert in doing a lot of different procedures, like intubating, putting in a breathing tube, or putting in different lines. Or some ICU doctors are trained to cannulate put someone on ECMO. I have done that. I'm not super proficient at it myself yet, but that is within the scope of intensive care practice as well. We decide what medications to put patients on. We consult with other services, and we're bringing together a grand concerted effort to help patients. Now, there's a lot of other details of what an ICU doctor does that I don't think I'll bore you with too much. But I will say it is a very difficult job. I know I'm biased here, but I do think it's one of the hardest jobs that there is, specifically being an ICU doctor. It's actually, I cannot convey to you what it's actually like. You only know what I'm talking about fully if you're an ICU doctor, in my opinion. So I'm not even going to really try to keep going. It's like trying to describe something that's very difficult to describe. The burden that is on us, and the sometimes moral injury and the moral decisions that we're faced with, balancing a lot of things like that can be very harmful psychologically to an ICU doctor, and that is a big part of the job. So I'll leave that at that. Let's move on to nurse practitioners and physician assistants. Now, I'm not surprised if you're a nurse practitioner or a physician assistant and you had me lump you both together that you're kind of cringing, because there are differences between the two. But sometimes functionally they're very similar. From where I'm at, from my perspective, I work with fantastic NPs and PAs, really fantastic NPs and PAs. And if you're listening to this and you work with me, you're awesome. Just know that you're awesome. And I don't care who you are that I work with. I know if you're listening to this, you're awesome, because I work with only phenomenal NPs and PAs. But in all honesty, in my practice, they're functionally extremely similar in my ICU setting. But I know they're very different in different settings. A nurse practitioner gets a bachelor's degree in nursing, gets a nursing license, and then goes to a graduate program, and then becomes a nurse practitioner. Physicians assistant PAs, they earn a master's degree. They pass a PA exam, and then they're certified to be physician assistants. The similarities are both are licensed healthcare providers, and they work alongside physicians. NPs can work independently in many states, which is, spoiler alert, I do not have a problem with. We need NPs, we need PAs. I do not have a problem with NPs working independently. I know many physicians do, and it's this whole dramatic thing that I'm just not going to get into. Both are clinicians. They can diagnose, they treat illnesses, they prescribe medications. Both require graduate degree, clinical training, board certifications. NPs often have specialty fields they go into. PAs have a more generalized medical education. Now, I'm sure I got things a little wrong about the difference between NPs and PAs. So forgive me. And please, email me, and I'm happy to make a whole podcast, just talking about NPs and PAs and to educate myself even more about their roles. What I will say is that they are a vital role and a vital part of the critical care team. They do all of the similar things that an ICU doctor does, alongside with an ICU doctor, also doing things independently of the ICU doctor. I consider them to be my colleagues. I work with them. They don't work for me. They're often more knowledgeable than me about many, many things. Some differences is they're not as experienced doing procedures, but some can be. The point is they're extremely vital to the team. And again, this debate about, I hate the term, there's this term called mid-level creep, which I hate. And if you're a NP or PA, I'm sure you hate it too. It's very insulting. And the term mid-level is generally frowned upon, using that by NPs and PAs. And I agree. Mid-level, you're a clinician. You're a clinician, and your work is extremely important. And having NPs and PAs being in the medical field and being in the ICU is good for patients. It's good for the healthcare system. And I don't, arguments otherwise don't hold a lot of water for me. Anyway, if you want to know what NPs and PAs do, just go back and listen to what I said ICU doctors do. And that's what they do. They are more doing it on an individual patient level. So they're not over the entire ICU. They're usually over like half the patients, and they split up, the rest of the patients with their NP or PA colleague. So they are providing direct patient care, but they do it more on an individual basis, whereas an ICU doctor may not be as individualized, although they should be, where the ICU doctor is over the entire ICU and takes responsibility for all of the decisions that are ultimately made in the ICU. Okay, let's move on to other members of the ICU team. One of my I shouldn't play favorites, of course, but another incredibly highly valued member of the team is a pharmacist. Pharmacists are the most evidence-based people in the ICU. Their judgment is not clouded as much by it's not biased by anecdotal thinking that physicians often do, including myself. Often physicians and providers make decisions based on their own anecdotal experience. Some physicians do this more than other physicians. Now, I'm sorry if you're a surgeon listening to this, but I do believe surgeons make clinical decisions based on anecdotal experience more than any other type of physician. I'm willing to be challenged on that, and I'm willing to have my mind changed about that. But from what I've observed, that's kind of how it is. But pharmacists are the most evidence-based. Their judgment is not clouded by anecdotal experience. They just look at the data, and they know data very, very well. They are a vital part of a critical care team, and they should participate on rounds. They should be present on rounds for every single patient. If they're not, that is a disservice to your patients because they fix errors, they catch things, they're unbelievably knowledgeable. I work with such fantastic pharmacists. All right, next let's talk about the person that is actually taking care of you. Like if you get admitted to an ICU and you're there, who is the person that is actually physically there the entirety of the time that is taking care of you? I'm obviously talking about the ICU nurse. The ICU nurse is one, obviously, of the utmost important and one of the most important people that is staffed in the ICU. That's an understatement. The ICU nurses probably have the most diverse role. So not only are they doing bedside nursing care, which is complex and laborious in its own right, but they are toggling between being a liaison between the patient, the patient's family, between the ICU doctor, the rest of the ICU team, all of the other consulting people that come into the room to see a patient. Meaning, if you're in the ICU and we need like a kidney doctor to come and see that patient, we consult a kidney doctor, and then the kidney doctor team comes by. Well, and as the sicker that someone gets, the higher complexity, the more people are involved with that patient. So you can have people going in and out of a patient's room in the ICU all day long. And the person that can put all that, make that all coherent and translate all that stuff to the patient and the family, and also provide information, bring it all together to the ICU team is the bedside nurse. The bedside nurses are often need to be diplomatic. I wish they didn't feel like they have to be diplomatic. And what I mean by that is they have extremely good communication skills, and they have to have good communication skills because they're dealing with a lot of different type of people all day long. So they are like spearheading the communication between everybody. They are part of end-of-life care decisions. When I do an end-of-life care conference with the family, I always make sure the current bedside nurse is there, and they want to be there. They are eager to be there because they have unique perspective of the patient's experience, what that patient is actually experiencing. They have that perspective, I think, more than anybody because they are there. They are getting to know the patient better than anybody. Their personality, their likes, their dislikes, and again, if they're suffering, how much pain are they having? Do they need more pain? Do they need better pain control? Is the bedside nurse that has unique insight and knows all of these things? And their judgment and their insight is just, it's beyond value. I have so many amazing bedside ICU nurses that I work with, all of them. They're phenomenal. I could tell you story after story after story. I had a patient who had a fairly routine cardiac surgery that was doing really poorly after, really, really poorly. Patient was on ECMO and was heading south really, really very fast. The bedside nurse, the ICU nurse there was taking care of this patient for 12 hours that day was phenomenal. She was constantly bringing me in the room, being like, okay, and knowing everything about the patient, literally just knew everything about the patient, all the vitals, all the drips, everybody that's come by, all the plans. And then she was constantly like, what about this? Do you think this? What about that? Being curious, offering suggestions. I was so impressed. I couldn't believe it. That a patient eventually died soon thereafter, like a day later, and it was very tragic. And that same nurse was there in the family conference explaining things and just being an advocate for the patient, if it was the right thing to keep going. I was just blown away. I was blown away. And that's not the first time I've been blown away by an ICU nurse. I could just talk about ICU nurses the rest of this podcast. They are my absolute favorite people. They get it. They're in the trenches. They get it. You know, they don't care about ego. They don't care about hubris. They don't care who's right. They don't care who's wrong. They care what's going on with the patient. I don't know. I'm falling over myself just gushing about ICU nurses. They're just my absolute favorite people to work with. They're awesome. I'd rather hang out with ICU nurses than anybody else at the hospital. I just wanted to add one more thing about ICU nurses. They're freaking smart. They're very, very smart, sharp, good people with very good judgment. Okay, let's move on to my next. I love these people, respiratory therapists. So what does a respiratory therapist do? We often just associate them with like, oh, a patient has a breathing tube and they help run the vent. They do that, and they're very knowledgeable about that, right? A ventilator is a complex machine with many dials, many settings. That's an hour lecture just talking about a ventilator, how a ventilator works. So not only do they know all of that, not only how to run that machine, but like if the machine breaks or if a component fails, all that stuff, they know everything about a ventilator. And a breathing tube management. So not only do they know all that, but they're experts in helping with a patient in respiratory failure outside of having a breathing tube. You know, so like right now you are probably listening to this and you're just breathing room air and you have no respiratory distress. But as soon as you start having respiratory distress, a respiratory therapist is extremely good at knowing what you need. I listen to my respiratory therapist. Sorry if I use that possessive. I don't intend that. That's just kind of a flaw of language. I listen to my colleagues, respiratory therapists. If they come up to me and they're like, hey, I think this patient needs this. They are right. They're right. I listen to them. I go on, obviously I go and examine a patient myself to make sure I agree. But they're right. They come up to me. They say a patient needs something. I listen to them and I act on what they have to say. When they are worried that a patient's respiratory status is in decline, they're very good at predicting that. They have many different skills, and their roles can be different from hospital setting to hospital setting, and probably country to country. I don't really know what respiratory therapists do outside the United States. You can email me and let me know. They're just they're very sharp. They're incredibly smart. They do research. They're awesome. Okay, next the people I want to talk about next, I do think are the actual people that they're so unbelievably important. And I don't think I'm like being facetious here. I believe that their therapies save people's lives often more than anything that I can do. And that's physical therapists and occupational therapists. And I'm sorry if I'm lumping those two together. That's just my flaw in how I think about things. But physical therapists restore the function of your body. Your muscles, your bones, your nerves. When you are critically ill, if you're not in medicine, you may not realize what happens to your body. When you're critically ill and you're intubated, you have a breathing tube and you're sedated, your body deconditions. It withers away. And if you're that way for weeks to months, it's just, and that will often lead to someone's demise, is because they're withering away and they're becoming deconditioned. So a physical therapist is responsible for maintaining your body's tone and muscle and function, even while you're critically ill, right? Making you get out of bed, and if you can't get out of bed, doing things while you're in bed, getting you walking around the ICU, and then after the ICU, you need to continue physical therapy, and then you need to continue physical therapy after you leave the hospital. It's an unbelievably important spectrum of care that is invaluable, and patients would not survive without physical therapists. Occupational therapists, they help relearn life skills, like grooming, feeding, dressing, and stuff like that. So, they help patients return to a level of independence that they have lost being in the ICU. So you have occupational therapists and physical therapists that are visiting a patient every day, if they're able, meaning if the patient is in a state that they're not so unstable they can actually have them visit. And they are the most important I just, when I see physical therapy therapists and occupational therapists doing this therapy with patients, I just bow down to them. I was like, you are saving these patients' lives. I can't overemphasize how important they are. Okay, and then dovetailing with them are speech pathologists, speech therapists, I should say. So you may lose your ability to not only talk but swallow. Do you have any idea how complicated it is for you to swallow and talk? For your nerves and your muscles to coordinate in this beautiful orchestra that allows your language and allows you to swallow food without it going into your lungs. It is insanely complex with many, many different tiny little muscles and ligaments all up and down that anatomy. And you can lose the ability to do those things when you're critically ill, particularly if you have a breathing tube in your trachea, in your windpipe this whole time sitting there, and you're not swallowing. You might be swallowing, but you might be so sedated you're not even using those muscles anymore, right? You just have secretions pooling in the back of your throat that are being suctioned out constantly. Again, those muscles and those nerves, that's atrophying and you're getting a decondition. A speech therapist is crucial in helping people swallow so they don't aspirate fluid into their lungs, and helping them with speech. They're unbelievably important. And they have many powerful diagnostic tools that they use. Their expertise is invaluable. Again, another very important part of the ICU care team is a dietitian. Now, these are people that I don't always interface with. Sometimes I do, but it's not like a daily thing, because oftentimes it's like a dietitian is in the background ordering things. So that I don't always interface with. So if you're critically ill and you have a breathing tube and you're very sick, you can't eat, but your body needs nutrition. So how does that work, right? We give you tube feeds, right? Either we put a temporary feeding tube down your nose or in your mouth, and it goes down into your esophagus, into your stomach, and then down into your intestines often, and we give tube feeds down that. Well, a dietitian figures out, what do we put through that? We're not making a burger slurry and putting it down there, obviously. A dietitian is licensed in nutrition, and they worked with the care team to make sure to figure out what nutrients that patient is lacking and to deliver them in a safe way. And they are constantly in the background doing that. There's so many things that they do that I am also ignorant of. This is really revealing my ignorance about what they do. But they're highly educated and highly qualified, and again, essential. So moving on. I do not work with this next group because I do not work in pediatrics. I work only in adult medicine. I do not pediatric medicine. I love children. I am a dad myself, and I love working with children. But pediatrics just does not appeal to me. I don't do pediatric anesthesia. It's just a whole other world full of complexity that I never wanted to dive into. So I do not do pediatrics, and very grateful for those that do. Anyway, I'm talking about a child life specialist. They're an expert in child development, and they work with sick kids. They provide play, distraction therapy, and they work in the pediatric intensive care. And it's been years since I, did pediatric rotations and stuff. So I can't even firsthand tell you like what they do and all the things. I'm very ignorant basically, but I just wanted to give a shout out to child life specialists for improving outcomes in pediatric in kids that are critically ill as well. Next person I want to talk about is a chaplain. So there's often, depending on a hospital, there's usually a chaplain on call, a clergy member in the hospital who talks with patients and families and staff. They provide spiritual support, and they can help find a clergy member of the patient's faith to meet the patient's spiritual needs. They play an incredibly important role in end-of-life care. They're crucial, a hospital chaplain. I just want to touch on, it doesn't matter what your view about religion is, what you think of religion, right? We could talk all day about all the badness that follows from religion, right? All the dogma and wars and the crusades, all that stuff, right? We could talk about that a long time, and that's usually what a lot of people. That's the only thing they focus on. Religion has a lot of unmeasured benefit to people, right? Religion probably like helped humanity have cohesive communities and have the same shared reality. Probably helped a lot of stuff that is not really measurable that people don't really talk about. The same is true in the ICU. So someone's spirituality, or lack thereof, whatever, but someone's spirituality, and if they have a denominational faith, obviously is very pertinent information, and it's very important for the ICU care team to know about. Right? That's something that should be ignored. And I do think some healthcare providers do. Not only do maybe they ignore it, maybe they don't ignore it, but maybe they scoff at it, see it as nothing but an obstruction, obstacle, because we'll sometimes blame a patient's spirituality or their family spirituality or the religion on clinging to their life when they're so obviously going to pass away and that they should let them go. And now that phenomenon does happen, it does, but that person is an individual. It's an individual who's dying, who's had a whole life that you don't know. You don't know this person, right? You've maybe known them for a couple of days or weeks, but you don't know them beforehand. They've had an entire life full of joy and sadness and depression and maybe religion is an enormous part, a huge thread throughout their life. And it's an important component of how they're going to die. And it must be taken into account when you're approaching end-of-life care. And that is what a chaplain can do. From my own perspective, if a family wants me, to pray with them, I oblige them, right? I wouldn't show any favoritism if obviously nepotism or whatever, if a patient is an atheist as well, right? I respect atheism. In fact, I should do a whole podcast about this, about religion in the ICU. I'll make a note of that. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is I don't care what your religion is, whatever. But if it's an important part, if you want me to participate as your doctor in some sort of religious ceremony or prayer or something, I'm happy to do that. I wouldn't officiate in anything, any capacity like that. I wouldn't do anything I wouldn't do it for another patient, but I'm more than happy to do that. And I do find that when a patient is dying, when they're clearly not going to survive, very, very, very likely not going to survive, I find if you are willing to do these things, you foster trust with the patient's family. It's all about how do they feel about the patient, about their loved one dying. How do they feel about it? How are they going to feel? They're going to remember you, okay, for the rest of their lives. There's a lot of people out there that will remember me for the rest of their lives only as the person standing over their loved one as they died. Like I am carved into many people's memories for the rest of their lives. This curly-headed Doogie Howser-looking guy. Anyway, is carved in people's brains. Anyway, what's my point? I'm getting a little lost in thought here, but I'm happy to participate in religious ceremonies and it fosters that trust and people want to feel good. Not good, maybe good's the wrong word. They want to feel at peace with their loved one passing away. Anyway, chaplains help with that. Next person to talk about are social workers. They're available at most hospitals. They provide invaluable support for families. And they help with the logistics of not like financial matters. They help with the logistics of transferring your patient out of the hospital. They are like the miracle workers behind the scenes that are really helping patients get where they need to be and to provide them with outside hospital resources that they need. They're very, very important. I interface with them often and communicate the needs with them. They're absolutely invaluable part of the team and very grateful for them as well. So there are medical equipment technicians. They oversee the appropriate use of medical equipment, the availability to a unit, bringing it to the unit, very often during critical times. They verify equipment safety. If things are functioning properly, they perform repairs. They're essential in making sure very, very complicated equipment is available and working and troubleshooting. And they often do much more than that. They can often do procedures and things like that as well. So medical equipment technicians are unsung heroes of the ICU. Radiology technicians, ultrasound technicians. There is a whole host of technicians that run the medical equipment, and they're just experts in doing that. That is vital for diagnostics and for everything. For the eyes and brain, the eyes and ears and the senses of the ICU to figure out lab draw, people that are drawing labs, the lab. All of that is how we collect data to even figure out what's going on with a patient. Who else? I mean, there's so many. There's more staff I'm forgetting about. There's like pet therapy. Pet therapists that come in and bring a dog. Everybody loves a pet therapist. The staff needs needs pet therapy as well. We all love when the dog, when they bring a dog for a patient, and that gets everybody excited. There's music therapy, people volunteering their time, coming in and playing the harp or the violin or whatever it is for patients in the ICU. These are extremely extremely important services for patients that are critically ill. So there are people I'm forgetting, and I do apologize if you're listening to this that I haven't named you. I know there's more people I'm forgetting that are part of the ICU care team. I just want to make the point that I mentioned earlier that I'm not a fan of power hierarchy. I'm not a fan of one person dictating everything. Right? And the classic model is that's the ICU doctor that's dictating everything. It should be consensus decision making. Everybody are colleagues. Everybody's an expert in their field. And everybody is coming together in a multidisciplinary fashion, in a collaborative way, to do what is best for a patient. When one ego or when hubris gets in that way, it shuts that process down. It shuts it down. Because when there's one ego that's dictating things, you create a fear culture, you create a culture that's not transparent, you create a culture where like mistakes can be made, and everybody makes mistakes, right? Everybody I just mentioned, that's all fantastic. Every single one of these people, we make mistakes, I make mistakes, everybody makes mistakes. Medicine is a human endeavor, and humans make mistakes. It's inherent. You can't get rid of it. If you have humans doing things, you're going to have mistakes. But if it's ego-driven, if it's one person driving things, those mistakes are not going to be caught, meaning people are going to speak up, and that causes patient harm, right? People don't speak up. People also, to thrive at your work, I don't know, whatever it is you do for a living, which, by the way, is not your identity, right? Your job is not your identity. I really hate that in our society, how it's like, hey, this is Jess, she does this. Like, why do we start that? That's how you introduce yourself, is what they do for a living. That's not what character. Anyway, I'll save that for another time. What's my point? My point is, for people to thrive, we need to be creative. That's my point. We thrive. The human brain thrives on creativity. We're not really supposed, we're not designed to like sit at a computer all day, right? I know I sound like the guy from Office Space, the movie, which is an amazing movie, but that's not what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to use our faculties and our creative mind. And you can do that at any job. You don't need to be an artist or a writer to do that. But you need to have your employment, your job needs to have that space. You need to have space to think creatively. And all the people I just talked about, everybody can think creatively. Everybody can be like, what about this? What about this? What about this? What's going on? Being curious, be creative is good for patients. So you don't miss stuff, because we all get blinders on. So if one ego is driving things, everybody gets anchoring bias, right? That one person is like, it's this. And so everybody will think that way. But that person can be wrong. I'm wrong all the time about what I think is going on with the patients, right? You can get anchoring bias. You can get confirmation bias. And then mistakes are made. And then in hindsight, they're like really bad mistakes. It's like, oh my gosh, how did this happen? Well, maybe it's because there was a dictator running things. And it wasn't a collaborative effort. So I strongly, strongly believe in consensus decision-making and collaborative effort. There is no room for the ego in the ICU. Your ego will harm patients. All right, let's shift gears to book discussion. Today I'm going to talk about The Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, which is a book published in 1968. This it was published in 1968. It was translated to English from Portuguese in 1970. Freire was a Brazilian educator and activist and intellectual, and this was a pretty influential book that I read about a year ago. So I'm going to go through it. I do have a lot to say about this book. I think it's a really important book that I do highly recommend. To kind of boil it down, kind of sum it up in a sentence. So again, think about the title of this book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, right? So the source of liberation can only arise from within the oppressed. That's kind of the theme of this book. I found the book to be like both timeless and timely for what's going on right now. It provides us a construct for the oppressed to not only recognize the system of oppression imposed on them, but also how to create an educational framework to seek liberation from that system. There are several rules and distinctions made clear in the book, namely that of the oppressor and the oppressed, and the tools the oppressor uses to maintain dominance and control. Some tools are familiar, like overt propagandizing, but there are more subtle levers of control that have far greater influence. A chief tool in my mind that's mentioned in this book is ensuring that the labor class is divided. And of course, that's just such a classic thing, right? From race baiting and xenophobia and immigrant scapegoating, class division is a tried and true method to fracture solidarity and create self-inflicted social injury by means of domestic strife. Sound familiar? Right. It's what's going on right now in the United States and other countries. The domestic strife serves as a grand distraction from whatever oligarchy that's maintaining control. Key in this class division is vilifying of unions, which tend to have a pesky tendency to unite across racial lines and create tremendous solidarity and even changing cultural zeitgeist. Fortunately for the plutocracy that controls us, right, the rich people in charge, neoliberalism for the last 40 years has made sure unionization not only never goes this far, but even gets created in the first place, right? We're at like an all-time low of unionizing, which seems to be, the winds do seem to be changing on that in the United States. A key methodology in maintaining dominance is fooling the working class into believing that they are part of the oppressor class when they are actually being fundamentally oppressed as well. Let me say that again. Key methodology in maintaining dominance is fooling the working class into believing that they are part of the oppressor class when they are actually being fundamentally oppressed. Cultural compartmentalizing is key. What this means is confusing the labor class and upper class about what freedom even means. You get them to believe that the defense of freedom is to maintain the status quo. This includes fabrication of a zero-sum political landscape, the illusion of scarcity, and then propagandizing a social threat. The goal is to see any forfeit of luxury as oppression to their freedom, when the truly oppressed enjoy no such luxuries in the first place. This will create great disparities about the language of freedom and propagate more confusion and more strife. Additionally, these kinds of social distortions create monstrous hypocrisy and double standards. For example, is there really a fundamental difference between radical Islam and white supremacist Christianity? They both have the same goals, and by the same means and function as like an inverse of one another. They're very similar. Even the generosity of the oppressors is a form of dominance. The generosity, which is almost always based on commodity, is at best disingenuous and based on the oppressive materialistic system that maintains control. Populist control is allowed to arise within a system of oppression where the populist gains the support of the proletariat, right? The proletariat is the working class. However, the populist must continue the agenda of the plutocracy, or that populist will not last. So that's why Donald Trump, who is a populist, the plutocracy in control consented because he continued to do what they wanted, which is what every president has done since like Ronald Reagan, right? So in many ways, Donald Trump, continued the same thing that Barack Obama and Bush, both Bushes and Clinton and Reagan, they've all done very similar things. Trump just put a demagogic, racist, sexist kind of twist on it. Anyway, this isn't about Donald Trump. As long as a populace restricts themselves to paternalism and authoritarianism or promoting dependency on a social welfare, the oligarchy will consent to their rule. So that's another thing we talk like paternalism and authoritarianism are kind of the same thing. But promoting dependency on a social welfare state is also bad, right? That argument from the right does have some validity. They tend to over-exaggerate, however, in my opinion. A key point in the book is that the oppressed are not the inverse of oppressors. What I mean is a revolutionary cannot use the same tools of oppression to create social change. This will only result in rebranded authoritarianism. Think about what I just said. A revolutionary cannot use the same tools of oppression to create social change. This will only result in rebranded authoritarianism. So the key point is that liberation can only come from the lived-in experience of the oppressed, with the goal to liberate, and here's another key point, the goal is to liberate not only the oppressed, but the oppressors as well from the entrenched system. Everybody is dehumanized in a system of oppression. The oppressed are dehumanized because they are treated as empty vessels, and the oppressors because they act inhumanly toward fellow human beings. So as trite as it may sound, sincere love and joy for all humanity is the only way to break a system of oppression and to unbind all that are bound. A huge danger for the oppressed is to internalize the oppressor image of themselves, right? Oh, I'll only be a peasant. To create this like deeply entrenched fatalism. The oppressed need to realize that they are more than the objects of the oppressor. And this brings me to what this book is really about: creating a pedagogy for the oppressed. Education is a key vehicle to maintain dominance. Traditional Western teaching, or what the author calls banking education, is to treat the student like an empty vessel to be filled with a knowledge base. Once that student is able to regurgitate that knowledge, they earn the accolades of the oppressor. Those that are unable to obtain this education are seen as lazy and deserving of whatever plight that they're in. Those that don't subscribe to the body of knowledge are considered pathological and in need of like re-education, right? Any attempt to, quote, educate the marginalized is again a form of oppressive generosity, as the goal is to simply assimilate that person into the existing system of oppression. And this is where the author is so emphatic. He speaks of an open dialogue-based way of teaching that decentralizes knowledge and promotes the creativity of the masses, which is something I mentioned earlier in this podcast. Creativity of the masses is key. And one cannot have true dialogue without humility and without asserting a monopolization of knowledge. Education is either a tool of conformity or a tool of liberation, where students learn how to think critically to transform society into something new. So overall, I really enjoyed this book. However, not all the material is really accessible to a casual reader. There were large chunks of stuff that was pretty, honestly, pretty incomprehensible to me because I wasn't really taking detailed notes. But overall, I listened to the audiobook of this, and I highly, highly recommend it. I think it's very pertinent to what's going on in our society right now. So again, the book I just discussed is The Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. All right, I don't think I have time today to answer questions, but so that I'll wrap it up today. So thanks for listening. If you've made it this far, thanks for supporting this podcast. And by supporting, I mean just by listening. I don't make money off of this. I don't intend to. This is a public service. I enjoy it. I enjoy engaging with people on TikTok and on here. There's not commercials, whatever. I do not make a dime. So let me know what you think of the podcast. Give me suggestions for topics. I would love that. My email is icudrecmo@gmail.com, icudrecmo, ECMO @gmail.com. I will prioritize emails because it's usually people that are listening to the podcast that are sending emails. So if I get an email from you, I'm likely to like answer your questions or do a topic that you're interested in if you email me, because I know I want to reward people that are listening to the podcast because it's people that care because they're listening. Anyway, if you don't follow me on TikTok, my ICU handle is ICU Doctor. And on Instagram, it's ICU Doctor TikTok, I think, something like that. ICU Doctor of TikTok, I don't remember. Anyway, whatever. You can find it on my TikTok if you care. Please leave a review because that'll help people listen to the podcast. And anyway, thanks for joining. I'll see you next week.